Hi, welcome back. Tonight's notes are going to be on properties of quadrilaterals. And this is actually going to be tonight's notes and on Monday's notes. We're going to be talking about properties of quadrilaterals. We're going to talk about two each night. This is on page 46. So, tonight's notes we're going to talk about two, like I said. The first one we're going to talk about are parallelograms. Okay, so parallelogram. Let's start by drawing a parallelogram. Oops. Let me just okay. Okay, there's my parallelogram. Ignore that little piece right there. So I have my parallelogram. Now there's certain things on a parallelogram that are true. So we're going to write the properties right next to it and label as we go. So the obvious one is that opposite sides are parallel. And I think that you all knew that right now, that opposite sides of a parallelogram are parallel. We denote that with little arrows going in the same direction. Opposite sides are parallel. This side's parallel to this side is parallel to that side. Okay? So that's the first property. The second property is opposite sides are congruent. Okay, so opposite sides are congruent. We can denote that by saying this side's congruent to this side, and this side is congruent to this side. Okay, those are opposite sides, and they are congruent. The next property that we know, opposite angles are congruent. So that means this angle is congruent to the one opposite, and this angle is congruent to the one opposite. Okay, so those angles are congruent. And then the last property that I'm going to give you is that the diagonals bisect each other. Now that word bisect, what does bisect mean? What does that mean? Bisect means they cross in the middle. So if I draw the diagonals, I'm going to draw from this point to this point to this point. When I say that the diagonals bisect each other, that means that this side is the same as this side, and this side is the same as this side. Okay? It is important that I have the correct number of tally marks because this is not congruent to this, so I need to make sure that I have 3, 4, and 4. Okay, so the diagonals bisect each other, which means it crosses in the middle. Okay, so why is all this information important? It's important because we can be given problems that we need to use those properties with. So let's do an example of when we would use a property of a parallelogram. Okay, so I'm going to have a parallelogram. Okay, so I have this problem right here, and it would say something like solve for x. Okay, now using the properties that I just gave you, how are you going to set this up? You're going to set up 3x plus 2 is going to equal 4x minus 1. Why can I set it up like that? I can set it up like that because my justification would be opposite angles are congruent. Okay, now you can just solve for x yourself. I'm not going to do that. That's just an example of when I would use those properties to solve a problem. Okay, so those are your properties of a parallelogram. Moving on, we are now going to be doing properties of a kite. So a kite looks like this. Okay, that's a kite. And a kite has a lot of really cool properties. Okay, the first one is it has at least one pair of opposite angles congruent. So let's write that down. At least one pair of opposite angles are congruent, okay? So that means that these angles are congruent. Angles could be congruent, but they're not necessarily congruent. So we say at least one pair because we know we're given that pair, but we don't know about the other ones. Okay? The next property, the diagonal, and this one may seem a little complicated. It's not. Let's just write it down and then I'll explain it. The diagonal that does not go through the congruent angles is an angle bisector. Okay, so what does that mean? The diagonal that does not go through the congruent angles, so these are the congruent angles, these are the non-congruent angles, is an angle bisector. That means if I go like this, and I make that diagonal, it bisects that angle. So that means this little angle and this little angle are congruent because it is a bisector. Okay, the next property are one diagonal bisects the other diagonal. So what that means is if I draw this diagonal right here, it's going to be a bisector right there. So that means that side and that are congruent. Another property about diagonals, the diagonals are perpendicular. So that means these are right angles right there. They're perpendicular. And then the last property is it has two pairs of congruent sides. So that means these sides are congruent and these sides are congruent. And then when would we use this information? Well, let's do a little example over here. We could say the perimeter is 25, solve for x. Okay. So which property that we just went over are we going to use in order to solve this problem? We're going to use that there's two pairs of congruent sides, because knowing that I can say that this is 3x and this would be 4x plus 2. And then I can set 25 equaling to all of that adding up, because I know the perimeter is all the way around. So that's just an example of using that property, and then you could say justify two pairs of congruent sides. The justification is going to be really important in this chapter, so we want to make sure that we always write that down. All right, thanks for watching.